Hi, I'm Deb.
This is Frankie V.
I'm Grant.
Hi, this is Phil.
I'm Aaron.
I'm Steven.
Hi, I'm Joe.
Hi, I'm Matt.
We're Tim and Terry.
I'm Susan.
Hi, this is Phil.
Seminary Dropout is supported by listeners like you and me.
Seminary Dropout is supported by listeners like you and me.
You should support the show like I did.
It's easy.
It's easy.
Just visit supportseminarydropout.com.
Just go to supportseminarydropout.com.
And I'm your host, Shane Blackshear. Interviews with leading Christian authors, leaders, and thinkers. Let's go. My guest, Nijay Gupta, is Associate Professor of New Testament at Northern Seminary, and he is also he founded the popular blog Crux Sola. Boy, I'm really botching this up today, Nijay. Crux Sola, and is the author of numerous books. Nijay, welcome back. I've wanted to have you for so long. I should also say you are just one of my favorite voices out there right now. And I mentioned you were the Associate Professor of New Testament. I know that was your title at Portland Seminary. Is that your title at Northern?
Hi, Shane. Thanks. Great to be back again. I'm a quote-unquote full professor now. I did about a year ago switch over from Portland Seminary to Northern Seminary to work with my friend Scott McKnight, and we just recruited Lynn Cohick to be our provost and professor of New Testament. So I like to say we're becoming the 1990s era bulls of New Testament studies, just getting the best and brightest to be part of this dream team. So, yep, I'm kind of pinching myself all the time, living the dream as a professor. So yeah.
Oh, you actually just cut out there for a second.
Oh, I was just saying, excited to be at Northern, and one of my favorite things is doing podcasts, connecting with students and writing, and so living my favorite professor life right now.
I mean, seriously, Scott has been one of my favorite scholars for a long time. You've been really influential for me. I read Lynn's stuff. It seems like Northern Seminary is like really stacking the deck these days.
Yeah, this is something about seminary. Shane, we talked about this probably 4 or 5 years ago when I was on your show last, but I think seminaries are changing because information can be obtained through lots of great textbooks, YouTube, iTunes, master classes with Zondervan, all kinds of great stuff. So people aren't just looking for content when they want a seminary. They're really looking for, I think, mentorship. They're looking for connecting with people that they trust. And so I feel like Northern has done a really good job of saying, like, who are going to be the thought leaders, who are going to be the theologians that are going to be really formative for the church. So we just hired Beth Felker Jones from Wheaton College as our systematic practical theologian alongside David Fitch. So I think it's an amazing model because I feel like mentorship is so crucial because there's so much information. We actually have the problem of too much information, and you kind of need someone to help you navigate through that. And I'm doing my best to try to help students to discern, what's actually good scholarship and how do we integrate that into our Christian life and ministry.
That's so cool. I think that's so valuable. So you, I feel like every time I turn around, you've got a new book out, and I am not completely caught up, but I have been digging in. So you've got 2 that you've released lately in the last couple of years. The State of New Testament Studies, I'll hold this up for people who are watching here, that you edited with Scott McKnight. And then this one, The Beginner's Guide to New Testament Studies. I want to talk about those for a little bit. So let's start with the State of New Testament Studies. This is super cool. This is like, 20 scholars that each wrote a chapter. And so the tagline is a survey of recent research. So, it's like what's recently come out in New Testament studies that's important. And so what stands out in your head of like recent studies that you feel like is super important? I know there's probably a list a mile long, but what sticks out to you?
Yeah, totally. Well, the book came out of this, there was a book written about 15 years ago, a little bit more than 15 years ago, called The Face of New Testament Studies, which is basically saying, there are like 1,000 books on New Testament studies that are published every year. Pastors can't keep up. Scholars can't even keep up. So wouldn't it be nice to have a handbook to kind of give students, pastors, what we call nerdy lay people, kind of a crash course or kind of occurrence of that scholarship. So Scott and I decided to update that with kind of what's been going on the last couple of decades. And we reached out to experts. So, what is going on? It's interesting to see how we're interpreting the New Testament differently in some ways than we did 20, 30 years ago. So, for example, something like narrative criticism. Back in the day, 20, 30 years ago, when you studied the Gospels, you looked for layers of sources. You're trying to figure out Q and what's the special L and what's special M. A lot of that conversation has moved on. There are still people that do that, but really interested in what's Luke's narrative angle. Or Mark. Mark used to be a marginalized gospel, wasn't studied a whole lot. And then with drama studies, with literary studies coming into New Testament studies, coming into gospel studies, we're asking all these questions about characterization, plot, sequencing, the kind of stuff that you and I love when we watch movies. And we say, when you say that's my favorite filmmaker, that's different than saying this is my favorite actor. You realize there are certain marks of a filmmaker, the way they look at camera angles, the way they tell a story a little bit differently than someone else would tell it. And we're starting to do that with the Gospels, which is really neat. Another thing we're doing, I'll just give you another example with the Apostle Paul, is for probably 30, 40 years at the end of the 20th century, we were really interested in the Jewish Paul, the Paul of Judaism, which is great. Post-World War II, post-Holocaust, we need to recover the Jewish Paul. But especially in the last 20 years, we've been interested in Paul in the Roman world. Things like Paul's engagement with the empire, Paul's engagement with politics. It doesn't replace those older conversations, but it adds more texture to it. And this is really important because aren't we asking a lot of questions right now about Christianity and empire in America?
Yeah, that's super cool. I feel like that conversation kind of gets hot again like every 4 to 8 years around the United States. Empire criticism conversation, and rightly so. That's super cool. Let's talk about the Beginner's Guide to New Testament Study. So you wrote this because fill me in if I get this wrong, but I remember I found, especially when I started seminary, when someone is, they have knowledge of the Bible and what's going on, but they jump into the academic setting, people are tossing out terms like you mentioned, like Q and L and all that, and you talk about what's the Paul new perspective.
New perspective,
new perspective. All this stuff gets thrown around, and it's like somebody's speaking a different language, and so.
That's right.
You wrote this book as like kind of an on-ramp for people to kind of be able to grasp onto those conversations. I have to say, like, I think we've all had books where we felt like it was hard to put down. This may be the first textbook that I felt was really hard to put down. It's so good, Nijay. So
thanks.
The tagline is understanding key debates, and that's what I love about it, because let's take one chapter, for instance. So what I did is I opened it and I looked at the table of contents, and I was like, I looked through and I was like, chapter 8, pseudonymity of New Testament letters. I want to read that. So I read that one, and then I went back, and then I just kept reading more chapters because I wanted to look at it. But here's what I like about it. So often, and I think even seminaries do this sometimes. The seminary kind of teaches the seminary's perspective or stance on something. And
Right.
people leave the seminary thinking that that's the only thing that people think about it. And so, for instance, in the chapter on pseudonymity, you lay out, here are all the different beliefs, stances on pseudonymity of New Testament letters. Here are the strengths of each of those, and here are the weaknesses, here are the problems. Right. And you don't even lay out, like, you don't do what some books do, where they say, and here's which one is correct.
The right answer.
Yeah, exactly. I love that so much, and I think we need more of that, and we can get onto this later, but when a lot of times, especially when these kind of discussions filter down into like the lay level or like social media, it gets the conversation gets so dumbed down, and people who are listening also leave with the idea that there's one perspective on this. And
Right.
and I mean, sometimes I hear people, I'm like, ooh, people say things that I've never heard before. And I'm like, there's probably a few scholars who think that, but it bothers me that you put that out there and are leading people to believe that that's the only legit, like leading you to believe that real scholars, all of them believe this thing I just said. And it couldn't be further from the truth. I think there are probably a lot of relatively settled things in scholarship, but there's tons of things where there's nothing close to consensus on it. And I love, that's
Absolutely.
what you do a really good job of, is presenting those different views in this book.
Yeah, Shane, and that's the plan of the book. I'll confess, when I went to seminary, I knew nothing at all about the academic study of the Bible. I was a relatively recent Christian, and I remember not even knowing what the word covenant meant when I went to seminary. And so I kind of faked it when people would say, oh, about, Dodd or, Schweitzer. I had no idea who these people are. Historical Jesus stuff. I remember how perplexed I was in seminary. Now I teach lectures on it, but back then, absolutely no clue what the professor was talking about. And so I wanted to write this book as a kind of cheat sheet for people who might go to seminary, might go to try to read an academic book and just have no clue. Like when people say apocalyptic Paul, what the heck does that mean? Or like you were asking, like new perspective on Paul. I hear it sometimes. I don't know if I could explain it to people. And so I sat down with Baker Academic and my editor, Brian, and we talked through how important it was that I was objective, which is why the original title was Across the Spectrum of New Testament Studies. I like this title better, but the idea was we want to give people as unbiased of a layout of the different views on major issues. Sometimes that was easier because I myself can't decide. Sometimes it was harder. Like, how passionate I am about women in ministry, women in the New Testament. And I tried to write this chapter objectively laying out both sides. It was really, really hard. I get people emailing me and messaging me saying, why didn't you push harder for your own view, which we all know, on this? Why did you give the other side attention? I don't like that. And I remember telling somebody, I don't like it either. It felt icky to me, but I know that it's the right thing to do for my students, to be able to say, here are both sides. Here are the arguments made in good faith on both sides. And then, what I do at the end of each chapter is I do a little bit of refereeing on pressure points. So I just say, okay, they disagree, but why do they disagree? And then I start to just talk about that. And I'm hoping that will lead to some exploration there. But Shane, also in the moment we're living in of polarized news media, everybody gravitates naturally towards one side. It's really hard to find a news channel that's quote unquote objective. When I wake up in the morning and have coffee, I listen to NPR. I know that is, biased in a particular way. Sometimes I cringe when I hear other news channels. But that just reminds me how important it is to be able to present well to people both sides of the story, so to speak, and let them kind of see the best arguments on both sides and to have those conversations. Same thing with Revelation. I've gotten some comments from reviewers that even though I tried to be objective, I still gave the rapture a hard time. Rapture doctrine. And honestly, I'll if it goes into a second edition, I might soften that a little bit. Some of that just came out because that's what I think. But I tried my best to be as neutral as I could.
Well, I mean, I think there's probably a challenge in that too, because also the other side of that coin is something else I don't want, which is I don't want something to be presented as, say, two opposing but even views.
Equal, yeah.
Yeah, equal views, especially if 90% of scholars agree, and then there's the other 10%. I don't want that to be presented as 50-50, if you know what I mean, That's got to be really tricky when you're writing something like that.
What was really challenging with this book, it actually has a predecessor in a book called Across the Spectrum of Theology, which was, I think, written in the 90s. And in that book, I think it was Greg Boyd and maybe Clark Pinnock.
Paul Eddy, I think.
Look at... Say again?
Was it Paul Eddy?
Maybe.
He's written a few. Anyway, Across the Spectrum. Yeah, Greg Boyd.
They look at classic theology debates like predestination and, really stuff that's been around for hundreds and hundreds of years. But with my book, there's some debates that are pretty new in the sense that I had to actually come up with what the views are and give them titles.
Oh, that's interesting.
And so that was really challenging. Like, for example, on the chapter on empire, I had to decide how would I articulate, are there two views? Are there three? Is there kind of a pro-empire, anti-empire, and neutral, or are there really just two views? So I was kind of worried about people's reaction to the book because I'm literally making up the categories as I go. But that's what I actually find helpful because I'm one of those people, I just need a little bit of a map. And then a big part of the book was the reading recommendations, just saying, okay, you've got a taste, now go read more. And I tried to provide even on both sides or two or three sides. But I felt like sometimes in seminary, my professors told me, don't read Bultmann, don't read Casemon, they'll poison your mind. And in my doctoral program, it was reinforced, read everybody.
Yep.
Like, you shouldn't be afraid of reading somebody. What you want to do is read in a discerning way.
Yeah.
But this idea, don't read them, that's actually dangerous for an education to say, don't read Bultmann. I only discovered later on, Bultmann's pretty great. I don't agree with him, but I think his heart's in the right place. And that's actually good to say, hey, he's got some great things to say. He has insights into scholarship. People disagree with him on these areas, but I don't like the philosophy, don't read that. That's going to... And you're saying that, I think you're hinting at that with some pastors who are basically vilifying scholarship.
Mm-hmm.
And that, I don't know if you listened to that podcast with Francis Chan on Preston Sprinkle's podcast, but Francis talks about how he was basically taught, especially at Master's Seminary, to vilify the other side. And then in his ministry, he actually got to know Catholics and other folks and realize, oh man, these people love Jesus. I didn't know that. And, man, that breaks my heart to think that that's happening in some educational institutions where you're treating other Christians as basically evil.
Yeah, that is so good, Nijay. And what we're basically doing is we're teaching people not to think critically because, well, I just feel like there's so few things out there that are like actually toxic. You know what I mean? Like there are books out there that I think I probably disagree with your main thesis and a lot of it, but I can cut the fat and eat the meat. And. Right. On the other side, what we're also doing is we're saying, but these are the good books. So you can uncritically just absorb everything in there and stop thinking for yourself. Just believe what this book tells you to believe,
Yeah. And so, I've written a lot of book reviews in my life, and a habit that I was taught was, as you're reading a book to review it, try to find three things that you found valuable in the book, and also three things that you want to point out as weaknesses. When you're in that mentality, you're reading critically, you're appreciating what's there to appreciate, but then you're also saying, I want to be on the lookout for things that I might not agree with for various reasons that I can actually back up. I think that's so healthy with anything we read, to be able to do that. Even the people we love, even the scholarships and the scholars that we love, to still read them quote unquote critically with a critical eye. It helps us not only in scholarship, but it helps us in real life too. When we're listening to a sermon, don't just automatically agree with Shane Blackshear when he preaches.
Yeah.
You need to have a critical ear. My youth pastor, when I was in high school, one time he purposely gave a heretical sermon because he wanted us to come to him and tell him he was wrong. And none of us did. And then he had to call us out on it and say, I said things that were obviously not true and none of you came to me. I remember that because it's such a great lesson. If I'm brave enough, I might try that with my students sometime.
That'd be awesome. That's a bold move for a youth minister. Good on him, I guess. So let's talk about a few chapters. Let's talk about pseudonymity. This was something that I hadn't done a dive into for a very long time. I remember in my seminary experience, it was kind of taught like, it was taught pretty well. It's basically like, a lot of scholars believe that some of the letters weren't written by who they're purported to be written. And I think most of these conversations center around Paul simply because he's the most of the New Testament and has several letters that are his authorship is in question. I was talking to I had Matt Bates on here. He's been on a couple of times. One of the questions that he asked on his podcast on Script is like, what's one of your like minority opinions about stuff? And his was, I think Paul wrote all the books that are attributed to Paul. I feel like that's kind of coming back to what it used to think. Like, I feel like more scholars are open to that, where before it was like, oh no, serious scholars don't believe that Paul wrote all the letters that are ascribed to Paul. Is that the case? Is that based on my anecdotal experience?
Yeah, that's actually a good insight, Shane. I think it's right in a way, but the way it's coming back is really unique. So pre-critical scholarship, you're talking about, patristic writers, medieval writers, they didn't really contemplate these issues. They kind of took for granted in many ways that the apostles wrote their letters. And then you have kind of the modern critical age of enlightenment, and you start to have these questions: is this really Paul? And do these things really line up? And so I think you're raising a good question. What's changed in the last 20 years? I think what's changed is not that we just said, oh, those patristic writers are right. What's changed is how much faith we put in our tools of being able to sniff out authorship. Even the category of authorship we've complicated in good ways. So, for example, let's take the authorship of a book, right? So I wrote a book recently, and one of my TAs, she wrote some parts of it, and I give her credit for that. But is it co-authored? In a sense, it is. If some of my doctoral ministry students, they write their dissertation, but they might have an editor go through and clean it up. In what sense is that editor an author? You have ghostwriters, and in what sense is a ghostwriter authoring it, co-authoring it, that sort of thing. So once you get into that, you're starting to really rethink some of those kinds of things. We know that Paul had letter secretaries, these which was very common in the ancient world, people that they played a role in professionalizing the material and making, so if you have a CV or a resume, you're going to send it, you might send it to a CV dossier company, and they kind of make it look slick. What do they really contribute to that? I worked with an editor at Zondervan. He gave me so much feedback on my book, and he cleaned up so many things. I told him, hey, you should get co-author credit, because he did so much work on it. So what we've been doing is we've been rethinking the category of authorship. Let's say Paul has a friend like Timothy, and he says, Timothy, I'm not able to write this letter. Can you write on my behalf? And he talks through with him all the big ideas. And then Timothy writes it. To what degree can we say that Paul didn't write it? So what we've done, Shane, is really complicate those questions. The example I like to give, I don't remember if I do this in the book, is, did you know that Charlie Chaplin entered a Charlie Chaplin lookalike contest and lost? He came in third place, and Bob Hope came in second. And so then you have to ask, why would Charlie Chaplin lose a Charlie Chaplin lookalike contest? Either, number one, he didn't look like his normal self, or number two, the judges weren't actually that good at spotting Charlie Chaplin. And I think in the case of the New Testament letters, we may have both. Paul was doing some things differently, maybe. And then also, how good are we at actually sniffing this out? So, for example, a friend of mine, Fred Long, he and I co-wrote an article about 10 years ago or so. And if I went back and looked at that article, I don't know if I could tell which parts he wrote, which parts I wrote. And then AJ and I, we do some writing together now. And I don't know if I can go through some of the things we've co-written and actually figure out. So I think what's changed is, number one, thinking through a multi-person, multi-dimensional process that Paul went through of writing, or Peter, or John, or James. And then on top of that, the fact that people do things differently sometimes. They produce different kinds of literature. Um, and I will say, with something like I'm writing a commentary on the Pastoral Epistles right now. I'll say there are certain turns of phrases and things that are true of me and you, that uh, if I started speaking with different turns of phrases, you'd think something's wrong, something's off. So there's certain features of some of the letters in Paul's canon that don't seem like him. And that leads me to believe that someone else is helping him out with the writing. There's some parts of our personality that just don't change, certain sayings, certain phrases. So Luke Timothy Johnson recently wrote a book called Constructing Paul. And he argues, which I think is pretty persuasive, Paul had different writing teams, and he used different writing teams to help him with different projects. And that's going to lead to some different things. And you could totally see that with a Seth Meyers or Stephen Colbert, where he changes some of his writers, and now some of his stuff comes out differently. I think that creates a thicker understanding of what did Paul write this letter actually looks like.
I like those illustrations. It's like, The Simpsons is really different than it was when I was in high school.
Totally.
You know what I mean? When like Conan O'Brien was writing for The Simpsons, it's very different now.
Totally. Yeah. And I think the bigger question we need to ask is, are there theological differences between the letters that are contradictory? So one scholar, he refers to the canonical betrayal of Paul in Ephesians and pastoral epistles. I don't think that's happening. But if that's happening, that would be troubling, and that would be something to talk about. But I think what we're realizing is Paul wasn't a neat and clean theologian in the sense of tidying it up into a nice systematic theology. He's able to express nuance and variety, and we need to take that for what it's worth.
Yeah, that's so good. So I saw someone's hot take on Twitter claiming that there are books attributed to Paul which are contradictory to Jesus's teachings, and those are the ones that Paul didn't really write. And I'm like, whoa. Like, you can probably find a scholar who says that, but don't put that out there as if that's just settled, knowledge among scholars out there. And so I think also, like, we can get real pastoral about this, like you have. Part of the question is, even if there is pseudonymity, and this is what you get into really well in the book, is does it matter? Does it compromise the authority of those books? And part of what you dive into is like, and I think this is what I was taught in seminary was, that pseudonymity was kind of a common thing back then. And so there was not intention of deceit in doing that. They were it was like paying homage, and you're kind of not in a manipulative way, you're borrowing the authority of who you're ascribing it to. And you point out that there's some difficulties in that and some pushback for those kind of theories. Is that right?
Yeah, I mean, let's take the example of the Gospel of John, which is not one of the epistles, but you have the beloved disciple, and there's all these comments in there that make it seem like the beloved disciple is the author. And I was just talking with my students this week that there's this comment towards the end of the Gospel of John that makes it seem like there are other authors of the Gospel of John. So what's going on? And one theory is, John or whoever is the main author, the collector of that tradition, created this gospel, maybe the first edition, and then when he died, his community kind of altered the text to pay respect to him, and maybe added a little bit more to kind of create a second edition, and that's what we have. Could that be going on in the epistles, where Paul's responsible for bits of the material, and then it's being put together by a package by one of his younger students or proteges. I think that's different than saying someone just with a mustache that they're twisting is deviously coming up with stuff kind of out of nothing, just making things up. Let's throw in some names, some greetings here, just kind of sprinkling things in. I honestly don't see that happening. I don't see that anyone getting away with that. So when there are a lot of personal details in there, like we get in 2 Timothy, for example, a lot of very, very personal details for Paul and his imprisonment and what happened to him, I can't see anybody making that up. I can't see a Christian just willy-nilly making up details that are completely unnecessary. You could just say, here's what's going on with me, or here's what you should do, the end. But to make up all these details, it just doesn't make any sense. And so, it's a complicated thing to look at. People like N.T. Wright, people like Luke Timothy Johnson have said, I think now is a time to kind of clear the board and start over. Let's just clear out all the garbage of what we've said is kind of the way scholars approach this, and start over. And let's not overthink it. Let's just. I think partly because we're looking at other areas of history and saying, maybe we're too quick to say that can't be true. That couldn't have happened. That person couldn't have done that. We're learning over time the truth is stranger than fiction sometimes, and we can't be so sure that this is pseudepigraphal. So the language you use now is disputed, which is everyone can agree on because it is disputed.
Because it is disputed, yeah. No, that's super helpful. As I was reading that chapter, to me, one of the things that makes the most sense is there was an early church who was receiving these letters. So if you get if the church is in the habit of throwing out books that were not really written by who they are purported to. In other words, if that matters, and it seems like there's some evidence that it did to the early church, if all of a sudden, decades after Paul died, a letter from Paul pops up that you're kind of suspicious about that as the early church. Does that make sense? Like, is there anything there?
This kind of did happen in the early church where they did have conversations about James. What's going on with James. So we think, we're the smartest generation. We can sniff out this stuff.
Right.
The early church was discerning this stuff. They were thinking through it. 2 Peter, I think also there was some questions in discernment. The issue of canonization, as I explain to my students, is really messy. I like to say Revelation almost didn't make it into the canon, not because it was bad, but because Gnostics were using it to kind of propagate their theories. I like to say that 2 books, especially 2 or 3 books, The Shepherd of Hermas, the Didache, and the Epistle Barnabas, almost made it in because they were just really, really good. And so I think to some degree, as Christians, we have to say God's Spirit was in those conversations as this happened. There's been conversations about whether the Academy is the best place to be formed for studying Scripture. I'm a big fan of the Academy. It's done me well. But if that's our only environment and the Academy can be very skeptical of everything, it's not necessarily the best place to form your Christian spirit, your Christian attitudes towards Bible study. There are really robust conversations going on right now in the Academy about how much confessionalistic perspective can be tolerated. And
that's interesting.
And so there's groups called Theological Interpretation of Scripture, and there's been questions about whether that's even allowed in the Academy because it comes from a place of faith. That used to be taken for granted as okay, now it's not. And I think for a while there we might have been looking at a split in the Academy. I don't think that's going to happen, but there are all kinds of questions being raised about how much can I bring my faith into academic contexts. It's always been a risky thing to do, but especially now. I think the Academy can give us a lot, but I remember Scott McKnight talking about his journey with the quest for the historical Jesus. I don't know if you know this story, but he was really heavily involved in the academic study of the quest for historical Jesus for decades. He was a contributor. He was a steering committee member of one of the major groups. And then he came to this turning point where he said, the academic quest for the historical Jesus can tell us that Jesus died, but it can't demonstrate that Jesus died for our sins. And that is a helpful case study for thinking through the limitations. Same thing with science. Science can tell us about the world, but it can't tell us why the world exists.
Yeah.
It can tell us maybe how it exists, but it can't tell us why it exists. It can tell us about life, but it can't tell us the meaning of life. And those are really important questions that sometimes are uncomfortable in the academy to have.
I mean, it feels like there's two major pitfalls. There's two ditches to fall in there. Because one, we could say only the faith, the confessional aspect, or disproportionately, and I've decided what I believe. Don't confuse me with the facts, Nijay. Or the other, which you're pointing to, which is just this is all purely academic. And I have stories of friends who lost their faith because their seminary professors had no pastoral bone in their body. If you come into seminary believing that the Bible just fell from heaven at some point, and then you get into these questions about pseudonymity and how the canon was formed, that can be really distressing for some people.
Yes.
And it's kind of like I heard AJ say on, I think it wasn't my podcast, I think it was a different one. He said, there's these truths that we need to talk about, but it can make the world a difference whether you hear that truth from Bart Ehrman on a YouTube video, or your pastor, or your seminary professor who has faith. That's why I think I love these books that you've written so much, is because we can simultaneously say, here's what we know, here are the facts, and also say, and here's why you can still be a Christian and believe them, why faith is still okay, and in fact, might be bolstered by these facts.
Yeah, I've benefited a lot from getting to know AJ over the last year or two here in Oregon. And as you know, he's a Pentecostal pastor and professor, theologian. My wife is a pastor at a Pentecostal church where we go. And one thing I've learned from the Pentecostals that have been really influential on me in the last few years is their faith is not in a particular biblical interpreter. Their faith is not in their pastor. Their faith is in their personal experience of God. And so it makes me wonder for people that kind of their faith disintegrates when they start to encounter biblical criticism and the messy questions, canon, and all the ugly stuff in the Bible and in Christianity. Is their faith built on their own personal experience of God, or is it built on certain academic constructs that are now being undermined, or philosophical constructs? And but I totally agree with you. You need, and actually I tell people, AJ and I have a podcast, and I tell people this is the trick of our podcast. We bring up messy questions and we don't actually give the answer, but we just model what it's like to be people that love Jesus, that are okay not knowing all the answers, and just lamenting at some of the ugliness, lamenting at some of the messiness, and saying, what's the alternative? Leaving one mess for another? We actually think this mess has good stuff in it. And if you leave, you're just trading one mess for another.
Yeah, that's right.
It's a question whether there's Jesus in that mess, whether there's the Spirit's power and grace in that mess, whether there's hope and love in that mess, rather than saying, I'm going to go out there by myself and try and find something better. And we say, if you can, great, do it. But I feel like many people who deconstruct and exit the faith, of course, there's some initial happiness, just like any time you're just like, damn
Something's
this,
new.
you move
Yeah,
on.
right.
Yeah, but long term, is there that deep satisfaction? I'm not questioning that people have that, but I'm just saying, for me, I go back to my quote unquote conversion experience. Jesus saved me from really ugly stuff, and that's what holds me to this thing called Christian faith.
So I know for you, you mentioned this a couple minutes ago, but just the issue of women in the church and in the way they're presented in the New Testament. It's been really interesting to see lately, especially on social media, that issue's kind of blown up. I think, Southern Baptists are sticking to their guns. And it's been really cool to see, Beth Moore kind of make some public statements about that. And she's recently left the Southern Baptist Convention. Books, all kinds of exciting books are coming out. Beth Barr wrote one. I can't think of the name. What's the name of that book? Do you know?
The Making of
Biblical Womanhood. That's
that
right.
right?
Yeah. And so she's like a Middle Ages expert.
Yeah, medieval historian. I
Medieval
think.
historian. And so she's kind of bringing to the table, like, you think that the church has only believed this about women in ministry, but actually it's believed other things in history, which has been so cool to read and to find out. What do you think? What else is there in that conversation? What's interesting to you that you think that maybe people aren't thinking about enough?
Well, I'm working on a book right now on this for InterVarsity Press, and my interest is really going back to that first century, because one of my concerns is that we superimpose what I call like a 1960s era American Leave It to Beaver, Little House on the Prairie construct when we use the word patriarchy. We just lay that as a construct and we say, oh, if it's patriarchal, then women are at home sewing and cooking and men were out hunting and working, this and that. And then we apply that to the church and we say women were sitting, listening, and men were doing, the important work. I studied classics as an undergraduate. I'm returning to some of that stuff now. And man, Shane, my eyes have been open to how we are just so wrong about the first century. Now, I will say it was 100% patriarchal, from basically the most legal things to, kind of sociocultural things. But I've changed the way I talk about the Roman world. Instead of referring to Roman patriarchy, I now refer to Roman class patriarchy.
Oh, interesting.
The reason I do that is because we think in terms of who's important in society. We think patriarchy means men are more important than women. And that's kind of the idea behind patriarchy. But when you add the term class, social class, which in America we don't quite understand because we deconstructed that in many ways, traditional social class. We still have economic class and blue collar, white collar. But traditional social class means you have certain categories of people that are more important than other categories of people. Think about the caste system in India. And what I've been learning lately is how social class, in a sense, can trump gender and sex. And we see this all over the ancient world. The Empress Livia, the wife of Caesar Augustus, became essentially the most important person in the world when her husband died. She had almost unlimited power, social power. She could get things done through all kinds of means. And then when you look at the early Christians, how much they utilized women of high social class, women like Lydia, women like Phoebe, possibly Priscilla as well, women like Nympha. And what's interesting to me is we have kept a lot of these people in the dark. But if you just step into that ancient world, the importance of their positions, social positions, are undeniable. There's a great book called House, Church, and Mission, which talks about how people like Paul had a strategy of sharing the gospel with people of high social class that ran households. We call them householders. And how that was an anchor for a church community. People like Stephanus in 1 Corinthians, and then people like Lydia, obviously. And we just take for granted these people, but they must have played important roles. So I wrote a chapter recently about Nympha in Colossians. Many people don't even know who that is. And one of the titles I have for the chapter was "The Most Important Christian Leader You've Never Heard of." Why? Because she's the only Christian leader that we can know of from Laodicea, what we think of as Laodicea. And she was a essentially single, possibly widow, female householder, which means she was the central leader of that church community. And so you have people out there like Kevin DeYoung, who I actually went to seminary with, and Kevin's out there saying, oh, women don't do this, that, and the other. And I'm saying, when you actually get on the ground in the first century, these women are everywhere, and they're doing essentially everything. People like Paul seemingly surrounded himself with women. How does he know all these women in Rome? How does he know them if he hasn't even been there? Romans 16. How does he know their names? And not only that, how does he know specific things about them? Because he's rubbed shoulders with them, because they're traveling. They're not sitting at home cooking and sewing. They're out doing ministry. So what's interesting is in my book, I'm trying to bring these people out of the light. I don't know if you've never heard of somebody named Damaris. I just studied Damaris for the first time. She is mentioned as one of the people Paul converts at the Athenian Areopagus. We forget who she is because it's just this little teeny tiny statement. What's a woman doing at a philosopher's club? And why is she mentioned in Acts? And people like Richard Bauckham, Alice Matthews say she's mentioned because she's remembered. She probably became an instrumental church leader in Athens. Educated women we know existed. Householders existed. We need to bring these people out of the shadows. And my students ask all the time, Shane, because I just taught a course on this. They ask, why was I not taught this? Why do I not know about the stories of Damaris and Nympha? And what's interesting, tell me what you think about this. A lot of it is how the New Testament and the Bible has been framed by some of our earliest teachers, our pastors, the books we've read. They kind of shape the way we look at the gendered social world of the Bible. And then it's hard to see anything else but that. And so there's some unpacking and reconstructing and deconstructing we have to do to be able to actually see these things like Romans 16 that have always been there. And yet they were marginalized. And I was never taught anything about Romans 16 until I went to seminary. And even then I wasn't taught much about it.
I mean, I think that so many of us were taught to read scripture in such a flat way. So we would hear these things you're saying and say, but does it say that? Does it say that these women traveled, you know? And it's like,
Yeah.
but if we believe these things have some historicity to them, then that is the practical inevitability of what was happening. I affirmed women in ministry long before this, but one of the things that really helped me understand it was one of the first early things was Scott's The Blue Parakeet.
That's right.
And, you know, it's like the book is mostly like, here's how to read your Bible. And then the last few chapters are, so let's apply that to women and ministry. If I'm not careful, I'll still fall into like, you know, reading Paul, I don't permit a woman to teach. And I'm just like, gosh, it really sounds like he's saying this is an absolute. But when you really dig into the culture, the context of him constantly affirming women who were doing this work, then it becomes apparent to me and obvious that this wasn't an absolute all-time command. You know, like it really flips it on its head when we stop reading scripture so flatly.
Yeah, you know, an exercise I like to do with my students is to say, let's name all of the people we can that were part of the church in Philippi. So, you know, you're combining some stuff from Acts and Philippians. So you say Epaphroditus, obviously, Clement, possibly, Euodia, Syntyche, and Lydia. You're naming 3 out of the 5 are women, but we don't really know who these women are. Many times we don't even know they're the names of women. Lydia, we know. Euodia and Syntyche, not so much. Paul specifically calls out Euodia and Syntyche, saying you need to agree probably on something really, really important for the purposes of ministry and things like that. Can you imagine a church that is more women than men, probably, in Philippi, and start to think through what's leadership going to look like if they're meeting in Lydia's house, as the book of Acts seems to suggest? It should reshape how we think. But again, the way we think about that world is so formed by our pastors, some of the Bible study books that we read. I think part of it, Shane, is seeing the New Testament not just as authoritative texts, even though they are for Christians, but as a window into the world of the early Christians. And when we do that, we start to realize that a letter like First Timothy is a letter to Timothy to clamp down on problems that are going on in that church.
Mm-hmm.
And when we start to say, okay, this applies to everybody, everywhere, all the time, we get into some serious problems because there's teachings about slavery. There's teachings about, hey, Timothy, stop drinking water, drink more wine. We all know that's not the way you should actually deal with acid reflux or whatever he was dealing with.
Yeah.
But we start to say, okay, if Paul said it, then that applies everywhere all the time. And I talk about this in the beginner's guide, that kind of direct universal approach to interpreting scripture is really dangerous because we can take that to an extreme and reinforce all kinds of bad stuff.
So tell me about your podcast with AJ, because I think this is going to be so good. You know, AJ came on the podcast to talk about his book, which is on, you know, faith and deconstruction and doubt. And I think it's so cool that you guys are following up with this podcast. It's called In Faith and Doubt. Tell me more.
Yeah. So I read AJ's book and then I reached out to him. He asked me for my feedback and I said, I love the book. I was like, this needs to be more than a book. This needs to be a movement because I engage with college chaplains, you know, all over the country, and they're desperate to put something into the hands of their students that are going through processes of just what you're talking about with starting to read biblical criticism, starting to get on social media and see people talking about all the messy things in Christian history. And, you know, they don't know where to turn to. They're not, you know, they don't know what literature to use. And AJ's book is brilliant because there's this narrative out there that once you start deconstructing, that's an exit plan to the faith. You know, there's this kind of, you move to the margins, and then you kind of have some nostalgia for Christianity, and then eventually you're out. And AJ is charting a different path, and he's saying you can engage directly these really, really messy questions. You can deconstruct some really unhealthy and problematic things that you see in the way you've been taught Christianity, and yet still hold on to Jesus. And, you know, what I told AJ after I read the book was, it's not so much that he says anything brand new. It's really just the pastoral way he says that this is normal, it's okay, and in many ways it's good. What you're going through as you're questioning things is good because you're trying to really get rid of some of the toxic things that maybe you were taught, some of the certainties that are not so certain, and that's going to lead you to deeper faith because you're turning back to Jesus to say, I don't know, I don't have all the answers. You know, part of what we're trying to do, Shane, and you kind of said this earlier, is we want to be safe people, to be able to just tell listeners, we also have those same questions about science, about hell, about how we got the Bible. We have those same questions, but we love Jesus because he proves himself true to us, even when all these issues kind of crowd in. And so just normalizing doubt and not marginalizing it. We hear from listeners all the time, these are things that I can't talk about with my church. I can't talk about with my pastor. I've recently just been telling people publicly, because I'm such a fan of it, that I've been going to a spiritual director for the first time. And for your listeners, if you don't know what that is, it's a safe person that hopefully has had a little bit of experience and training in spiritual direction, but that can just be someone to help you discern what God's trying to say to you in your life without giving you all the answers. And, you know, what my spiritual director often says is pastors and Christian leaders, they just bottle up all these doubts and questions, and then they explode. And they explode into affairs, scandals, or just deconstruction, deconversion. And, you know, Shane, you've seen it. So many Christian artists, pastors, celebrities just saying, I'm leaving the faith. If they had a spiritual director walking life with them and saying, that's normal. What you're experiencing is normal. what you're experiencing, isn't deconstructing Christianity. It's just calling a spade that we just don't know the answer to some of these questions. That's what we're doing, and we felt like people have really resonated with this. We don't want to reinforce a culture of skepticism, but we do want to say, so you might have heard me use this hashtag slow theology.
Yeah.
And what we're trying to do with that hashtag is just say, along with slow church, slow food, God's goal for us isn't to give us a perfect doctrine like that. There are some things we should know in our heart about Jesus and about the way God loves us. But God forms us often by not giving us answers and by just calling us to him. And so I feel like with my students, I'm getting a lot of traction on this idea of slow theology. Forming the whole self often involves us actually denying the validity of trying to find all the answers.
What I love about that so much and why I think it's so needed is there's so many people out there who are making a career of deconverting people, and I don't mean to put them down. I think most of them are doing it in good faith. They don't think that any of this is real, and so they want people to find the truth. But often what they do is they take something that's real. Look, something we've been talking about, pseudonymity, okay? The guy you think wrote all these letters didn't really write these letters. Game over for the authority of the Bible, and then that means game over for Christianity. And so what I like is you guys bring the scholarship to the table, and you bring the pastoral heart to the table. And those two things are all too rare in Christianity today. And so you can say, well, here's the facts, here's why you can still believe, and why it still would make sense to follow Jesus and have a faith.
Yeah, an analogy that I use a lot with my students is kind of seeing the Bible as a guitar. So I'm a hobby musician. I love stringed instruments, and the way that a guitar makes music is through tuned tensions. And so I remember, a theologian once saying on social media, a modern theologian, something like, if Jesus and the Old Testament contradict each other, Jesus wins. And one of my students, she messaged me and she said, "What do you think about this?" And I said, it's perpetuating the lie that tensions are bad. Scripture is full of tensions. I wouldn't call them contradictions. I'd call them tensions. And the tensions aren't there to be cut. You cut strings on a guitar and you got a big problem. They're not there to be cut. They're there to be tuned. And once you tune them well, then there's beautiful harmony. It makes music. It makes music on the basis of tension. And if we had that philosophy in our Christian life, if we had that philosophy in the way we read the Bible, I think we'd get so much more out of it. Scott McKnight and I have been talking a lot about Eugene Peterson because of the recent biography. And what I like about Peterson is just this idea of slow theology. He's not the kind of guy that gave answers. He's the kind of person that used mystery, used paradox, used anecdotes and parables to give us wisdom that slows us down. So I guess that's what I'd want to say to people that are wanting to learn about the Bible, learn about God, is what you're reading causing you to kind of tie things up in a neat bow, or are they causing you to slow down? And if they're causing you to slow down, then you're getting into that music making good tension.
That's beautiful. Yeah, man, write that book, please. # slow theology.
Slow theology.
Nijay, I was looking, it was 2016 when you the first time you came on the podcast. I've been wanting to talk to you again ever since. This was so fun. And when I reached out to you, I said, well, is there anything you want to talk about? And you wrote out a long list. And the last thing you wrote was food. Full stop. Before we go, talk to me about food real quick.
Oh man, so I'm a foodie, and food's been my coping mechanism during the pandemic. So I've gained my pandemic 19 and maybe another pandemic 20. But yeah, I love just the art of food. I make a lot of Asian food. I will just brag a little bit and say I think I perfected the art of eggs over easy. We
Oh,
do eggs over easy on toast with butter, and then sliced avocado
mm.
and pickled onions and Himalayan pink salt. So there you go. That's your food
Oh,
zen for today. Make some eggs over easy.
you're
My next challenge, which I've never even tried, is to master poached eggs. That's masterclass for me. That may be the next podcast.
I've never tried, but it looks difficult. But you are, dude, you're right up my alley, man. Like breakfast food, some avocado.
Oh, I love breakfast.
Oh gosh, yes. So good, so good. Are you a barbecue fan by any chance?
Oh my gosh, I love barbecue. As soon as the rain stops in Portland, I uncover the grill, and we probably use the grill almost every night. My favorite is boned chicken, like chicken quarters. I found this Belizean spice pack from Belize, right? Put that on there. Jacobson's salt and pepper steak mix. Can't go wrong.
Come to Austin, man. I'll take you to my favorite barbecue joints.
Absolutely, absolutely. I'm also a connoisseur of barbecue sauces. If you're ever in this area, my favorite is one from Washington. Oh, I'm gonna forget the name of it, but there's a famous state fair where they do barbecue sauce,
Okay. All right.
and they make the. I bet the South has better barbecue sauce, but at least in this part of the country, that's my favorite barbecue sauce.
I'm not a snob. I will say,
Okay.
Franklin's here in Austin's world famous. It's great, but you have to get in line like at 7 a.m. right now. And so I've got my places there's a guy here who's kind of like a disciple of Franklin that's, in my opinion, just as good. The line is not near as long. But no, I'm not a snob about it. If any part of the country you see you have great barbecue, great, and I'd be up for it. So, and Kate and I are actually going to take a trip to Seattle later this summer. So maybe I'll look out for that barbecue sauce while I'm there.
Definitely.
Yeah.
Definitely.
Hey man, thank you so much. This has been so fun. Yeah, let's do it again soon. Let's not wait 5 more years.
Yeah, and I think when I met with you last time, I tried to convince you to go to seminary, Portland Seminary. Now I'm at Northern.
Now you're Northern.
So we need to change your podcast to seminary registered, seminary matriculated. But you're always welcome at Northern Seminary for some slow theology.
Thanks for joining me for another episode of Seminary Dropout. Remember, you can find all the show notes for this show and all shows at shaneblackshear.com. Oh, and hey, have you ever thought about starting your very own podcast? I bet you have. And I think you should do it. In fact, I've created a course just for you to teach you everything that I've learned over the last couple of years producing Seminary Dropout. So if you're interested in podcasting and want to learn how, go check out my course. You can go there by typing in podcastingforeveryone.org. And you can get a special discount by typing in the discount code Seminary Dropout, all one word. That'll give you 25% off. So go check it out. If you have any questions, let me know. Okay. Thanks to those that left ratings and reviews on iTunes this week. Remember, that keeps the show front and center. Also, remember, you can find me on Twitter at beardonabike. That's at beardonabike. Also, I'm on Facebook, facebook.com/ShaneBlackshear123. And remember that Seminary Dropout is listener supported. You can visit supportseminarydropout.com and press Become a Patron. Remember, this music you're listening to right now is by D.L. Rossi. You can find him online on iTunes and at dlrossi.com. All right, thanks again for joining me for another episode of Seminary Dropout. Stay tuned for next week's episode. Love you. Take care.
Yeah, my best.